Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. This actually now completes the hat trick for me. I will have hosted one of these events from Asia, from Europe, obviously, and now from the US. So for me, good morning, but I'm very pleased to say good afternoon, particularly to our speaker today, Emmanuel Monk. He'll be well known to many of you. Um, he is a professor now at the very exciting department in Frankfurt, which has just opened a new Center for Central Banking. I'm sure I got the name incorrect, but it's very exciting to have this development. Obviously, Frankfurt has two central banks, so very exciting to also have a center studying them. Usual rules: if you are in the audience and you want to ask a question, if you put it in the Q&A feature, we will generally go for Emmanuel present for about 45 minutes. And then after that, questions, I will interject with questions as they come, but also, at the end, there'll be some time for discussion. So, Emmanuel, do you want to, with our welcome to the webinar, why don't you share your slides and we'll let you get going.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mike, for having me and for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here and present this recent paper of mine, which is entitled A Kiss for Central Bank Communication in Times of High Inflation. Kissing is not usually associated with central banking, or central banks are not usually associated with kissing. So I'm sure you're excited to hear more about what this KISS is all about. This is joint work with Matthias Hoffmann and Guido Schulte-Frankenfeld from Deutsche Bundesbank, and Laura Pavlova, formerly Deutsche Bundesbank, and now at the ZEW Institute in Mannheim. And Matthias and Guido are central bankers, so a disclaimer applies for both of them. All right, let me jump right into the presentation. So what's the motivation for this paper? It's actually fairly simple. We all know that very recently, after the war, the pandemic, and then also the war in Ukraine started, the global economy and also the euro area experienced unprecedentedly high inflation rates and a corresponding rise in inflation expectations. And major central banks, including the ECB, responded to this inflation surge by sharply hiking policy rates. But not only that, they also started increasingly to use communication to steer inflation expectations in this environment of very high inflation. Of course, there's a concern among central bankers that such periods of sharply rising inflation are basically leading to unanchored inflation expectations. And so there's an urgency by central bankers to bring back down inflation expectations towards the target. And so communication is used as a tool essentially to achieve just that. And communicating with the public has become in recent years more so a crucial part of the central bank's toolkit. And that's also very explicitly noted by central bankers, including Christine Lagarde, who in, I think, her first speech as an ECB president, one of the first speeches, said in Frankfurt that we will be open, transparent, and accessible, and we will try to talk in a language that everyone can understand. So it's clear that central bankers, including representatives from the ECB, really try to make an effort in communicating to the broader public in a way that's understood, and by that steering inflation expectations, among other things. So what do we do in this paper? Well, we examine to what extent central bank communication can influence households' inflation expectations, particularly in times when inflation is high and volatile. And so to that effect, we elicit inflation expectations in an environment where inflation was actually rising and historically high. And so that sort of distinguishes our analysis a little bit from much of the previous work in recent years that has studied inflation expectations, but mostly in the context of fairly low and stable inflation, okay? We do what many people in this literature have done in the past several years, using surveys of consumer expectations. We use a randomized control trial and provide participants in this in this survey experiment with different pieces of genuine ECB Eurosystem communication on the medium-term inflation outlook. And so I want to be explicit from the outset that what we're studying here is really actual pieces of communication that we took verbatim from basically the ECB representatives, interviews, speeches. And so we're not really studying sort of epsilon variations of a particular type of communication and then try to disentangle what particular epsilon variation achieves sort of what. We're literally looking at very different types of communication, but they're actually taken from the verbatim from the sources, communication sort of sources of the ECB and other national central banks. And then we analyze which of these existing forms of central bank communication are most effective in stabilizing inflation expectations. So particularly in this context of high and volatile information, how strong is the reductions in other reductions in inflation expectations that we can observe when providing consumers, households, individuals in the survey with these various pieces of central bank communication.
So Emmanuel, can I?
Sure.
I'll turn it into the seminar style immediately by
Absolutely.
asking.
Yes, please.
Right, so I guess one question is, you know, to what extent or what level of accuracy are we thinking about managing households' inflation expectations? So some of the words you used really appeal to me, like stabilize. So like if they're at around 2 or 3, we don't want them going to 10. But I guess I'm probably a little bit skeptical of the idea that we can take a 2.3 and make it a 2.1. I don't know where you're going to fall on that spectrum.
We're going to see that when we actually fielded these surveys, inflation was much higher than the 2% that we and central banks want to achieve, and we'll see that inflation expectations are sort of brought down in sort of moderate amounts by the different types of communication. So I'm not trying to suggest that with this type of information or communication, you can really steer to a very sort of very precisely households' inflation expectations. All we're trying to show is to what degree, and the degrees will be moderate, as we'll see, but different in interesting ways, to what degree central bank communication can actually lower inflation expectations. And it can, but again, to various degrees, and I think moderately so on. Okay, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's good.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, I see something in the chat. Should I, or you'll moderate, right? So I keep going unless you tell me to stop. Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. So so what are the main results that we find? Well, verbal communication, especially using qualitative, non-technical language, has a stronger impact on households' inflation expectations than numerical statements. We also observed that soothing, or what we call soothing, positively framed communication seems to be more effective at reducing inflation expectations compared to simple quantitative projection or simple quantitative presentation of inflation projections. And we also find that providing information about the inflation outlook in a simplified graphical format, so with visuals, is actually very effective across all horizons. And so we conclude from sort of these different results that central banks should keep it simple. So present their information, their communication in simple, qualitative, non-technical language, and potentially using visuals. And so we basically say they should keep it super simple or KISS, and hence the title of the presentation.
I have to just as a small remark, I was glad that it's super simple rather than the original meaning, right?
Yes.
The impression. I know you've left the central bank behind, but I don't think central banks should be thinking of their citizens as the other meaning.
Exactly. I know we were debating it, but quickly thought that this is the better way of summarizing the KISS principle in this context. All right. So in the interest of time, I will skip the related literature. Let me just say that there is, of course, a long strand of literature that analyzes the effects of central bank communication. And some of the people probably in this virtual room have contributed to this literature. The literature has sort of looked at trying to understand how communication works when the message's content is focused on, say, the inflation target or inflation forecasts, or the policy instruments, or aspects of central banks' strategies. And we also have 2 papers on that. There's also been recent work looking into how this messaging should actually be done, how messages should be designed. Relative to the clarity, transparency of the message, the tone, who the sender is, and also looked at Mike, for example, has thought about how to layer and simplify language. So let me leave it at that with the literature, and instead move on to the experimental setup that we have in this RCT. So we conducted this experiment within the Bundesbank online panel households. That we established a couple of years ago when I was still with the Bundesbank. And precisely, we used 2 waves of this survey in March and October of 2022. And those were actually periods when inflation was sharply rising and also sort of at the peak in sort of this recent inflation surge episode. Let me just show you the chart in case you've already forgotten, but this is basically Euro area HICP and German HICP inflation since 2002. And while inflation was long stable, we know it's actually gone up to historical highs in sort of starting in the summer of 2021 and then well into 2022. And the 2 dots here show when we've fielded the survey. So in the context of sharply rising or peak inflation. And so we think that this sort of is an interesting aspect of our analysis because much of the prior work has looked at inflation expectation formation in a context of more moderate and not so volatile inflation. And so we think that this is an important context.
So Emmanuel,
yes.
I totally agree it's an important context, and you can feel free to plead the fifth on this question. How much of the timing was luck and how much was by design? Like how much of a lead did you have to do with the panel to be able to get it? I mean, you got really great timing, but was it luck?
So I mean, it's to some degree. I mean, inflation had already gone up, and so we were sort of discussing that we should look into this question maybe for a couple of weeks. But then, especially if you have co-authors who work at the Bundesbank, it's you don't have to wait for months and months. You can sometimes also fill in ad hoc questions into the survey, and so the timing was to some degree. I mean, maybe luck, but also. But also, of course, due to the fact that 2 of my co-authors work at the Bundesbank and so have sort of first-hand sort of can use this the survey. I think, but we had debated this already in 2021 when inflation had started to go up, and we also have 2 prior papers where we study the response of households to changes in the strategy of the ECB or the hypothetical strategic changes that we used, and so this was already sort of in the works a little bit. This sort of agenda that we're studying, and here it's a sort of a different, slightly different context. Cool. Anyway, so the sample size is also fairly large in the survey. We have about 5,000 individuals in both of these waves that have responded, representative of the German population. 16 years and older, the online population, I should say. All participants in our experiment receive an introductory text about the 2% inflation target that the ECB has, just to sort of provide them with some sort of basic framing and reminding them of what the ECB tries to achieve. We split the sample into a treatment and into a control group and several treatment groups. All the treatment groups, we asked for the 2 to 3 years ahead inflation expectations, so medium term, which is sort of the policy horizon that the ECB and other central banks mainly pursue. And then we basically give different types of communication pieces to the different treatment groups. And we categorize them into numerical, verbal, and visual types of treatments. Okay, each treatment group receives only one piece of information. Okay, that's important. And then after we provide them with these pieces of communication or information, again taken from ECB and National Central Bank communications, we ask again for the 1 year, the 2 to 3, and the 5 to 10 year ahead inflation expectations. Okay, so that's the experimental setup that we have. Now, let me briefly talk a bit about the different types of treatments. So in the what we call numerical category, we have two information types of information provision that basically summarize the most recent at the time ECB staff projections and also the revision in the second. So, for example, in the October 22 wave, and the one for March of 22 was similar, just a different most recent projection. We give respondents information on the recent staff forecast for the next 3 years. So exactly the sort of horizon over which we then also elicit inflation expectations. And we give them the numbers from the staff projections, which in September 22 were 8.1% for 2022, 5.5% for 23, and 2.3% for 24. So that's the first numerical treatment. In the second numerical treatment, we also give essentially an additional piece of information which sort of lets households understand the revision in the forecast. So, for example, in October, we gave them both projections for June and September 2022. And so the numbers that we gave them were basically, again, the 8.1, 5.5, and 2.3% for 22, 23, and 23 respectively. Okay, but also we gave them information on the June projections, which were lower, 6.8% for 22, 3.5% for 23, and 2.1% for 24. Okay, so we basically show households that inflation projections by the ECB had been upward revised over these 3 months. Okay, in the visual category, we basically fielded in only October 22. We only thought about this in the sort of when sort of thinking about the first sort of results and looking at the first sort of results. We also then fielded a question where we basically took a snapshot from the ECB's website, exactly this chart here, and showed individuals the September 22 projections as a graph. So the same numbers that I just gave to you. So current and past inflation of in 2021 of 2.6%. And then the projection from September 22 of 8.1% for 22, 5.5% for 23, and 2.3% for 24, but presented as a graph. Okay, and so this again is exactly taken from the ECB's website. It provides the exact same information as the first numerical treatment, but presented in a particular graphical way. The fourth treatment that we also sort of subsume under the category visual, again, is sort of similar to the second, the forecast revision treatment, the numerical that I gave you before, but presenting results in a table format. Okay, so basically showing again the June and September 2022 projections for the next 3 years. Now not summarized in a sentence with numbers, but in a simple table along the lines of what you see on this particular chart. So again, this mimics the forecast revision treatment 2, but now presented in a visual way. The next 3 treatments that we have, or the final 3 treatments that we fielded, we summarize under the category verbal, and we included those in the October 22 wave. The first is a quote by Bundesbank President Nagel from a newspaper interview, where he basically worried about inflation being high for some time, but also projected a decline. In the sixth treatment, we then add a sentence that he also said in this interview, where he basically said that the ECB had recently hiked rates by 75 basis points in September 22. So he basically, we just add a sentence that he also mentioned in this interview, where he basically not just projects inflation rates to be high or remain high, but also said that the Governing Council had responded to these high inflation rates by hiking policy rates sharply. And then the final treatment we took from the Jackson Hole speech of ECB board member Isabel Schnabel, who in August 2022 at Jackson Hole in a speech basically said that she understood worries about high inflation rates and highlighted that central banks were acting decisively to bring inflation back to the 2% target. And she also provided information on the 75 basis points rate hike of September 2022. And so, so basically this is a treatment that we call GC, so a Governing Council action, basically saying the Governing Council is acting to respond to this surge of inflation expectations. And then there's a control group that doesn't get any additional information. All right, now let me, sorry. Oh, this is basically for, in case you're interested, this is basically a quote exactly along the lines of what we provide households with. Okay. Now, let me also say that we fielded additional questions in October 2022, where we sort of looked at the attention, self-reported attention and media use of households. We were basically asking how often do you or how attentive are you to inflation developments? And many households in Germany actually are sort of traditionally worried about inflation. So about 30% responded they're always attentive to inflation. So not really any more than typically, but 50% also said they're more attentive now in the context that we were in at the time of highly rising and volatile inflation. Only very few said they're less attentive, and about 15% said they're generally inattentive to inflation. Okay. We also asked about media use and how quickly individuals would hear about the ECB basically doing something. And many said that they would hear on the same day or in the same week. A bit to my surprise, I would have thought that fewer actually learn about what the central bank is doing, but they seem to be reporting at least that they are. About 7% say they never really hear anything about what the ECB does. Okay, what type of media do households report to be consuming? The central banks sort of own channels, so website predominantly, or social media channels, not very much. Social media to some degree, more of course among the younger generation. Radio and TV, very dominant sources of media, and print media in Germany still. Okay. So that's sort of the self-reported media use in the two waves, March and October. All right. We then use a probabilistic format to elicit households' inflation expectations. Specifically, we give them different bins and ask them to attribute probabilities to inflation falling into each of these sort of intervals of the horizon that we ask them. Again, we asked different forecast horizons, 1 year ahead, 2 to 3 years ahead, and 5 to 10 years ahead. In March, we chose a 6-bin histogram for expected inflation, basically inflation being below 1%, falling between 1 and 2, between 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5, and 5 and above. And at the time, sort of this was basically the range of inflation realizations that we had observed up until then, where inflation hadn't really been above 5% in recent decades. In October, then inflation had surged more, and so we added 2 more bins between 6 and 7 and above 7%. And again, as you had seen before, inflation actually surged to more than 10% in around that time. So this was the context. But when we basically fielded the question, 7 was sort of the maximum realized inflation over the history of the Eurozone. So that's how we chose these bins.
And just to check, Emmanuel, so you use the same bins for all horizons in a given survey wave?
Yes, we do. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Let me now come to our findings. So here is basically a histogram of the untreated 1 year ahead inflation expectations for these 7 bins. This is from the October 22 wave. And the treated, where we pool all the treatments. Okay, so we basically lump together all the treatments, numerical, visual, and the third category. And so what we see is that basically, well, the untreated, or everybody had very high inflation expectations, way above the 2% inflation target that the ECB pursues. In this context of extremely high, unprecedentedly high inflation, with basically more than 40% in the untreated group thinking inflation in the next year will be above 7%. When you look at the treated, you see that while there's still the majority of people who say that inflation will be very high, above 7% in the next year, the distribution is considerably shifted to the left. So these treatments, they do lower inflation expectations quite substantially, especially in this sort of right tail of the forecast distribution. So the distribution shifts towards the left, and so these treatments seem to work. That's sort of the first graphical impression that you get from looking at these numbers. And that's also true for the longer horizons to a somewhat smaller degree, of course, because in the longer horizons, so 2 to 3 years ahead, and then 5 to 10 years ahead here on the right, there's less mass on the right tail of the distribution. So these very high inflation projections, inflation above 7%, say, in the tail, there's fewer people expecting that. But even those, the number of those expecting very high rates of inflation at these horizons is significantly reduced by these pool treatments. So combined, these treatments work in sort of shifting inflation towards the target. Of course, as you see here, they don't shift inflation or anchor inflation at the 2% target. Okay, so there's quite a bit of distribution to the right of the target, even at very long horizons. So you can still argue that basically at the time inflation expectations weren't fully anchored at the inflation target of the ECB, but these treatments worked, quote unquote, in getting inflation closer to the target and reducing inflation expectations, particularly in the right tail of the distribution. Okay. All right. Now, these are just some sort of visual summary statistics of histograms. We now want to basically show you sort of quantitatively how much have these different treatments worked to reduce inflation expectations. And to this end, we basically compute from these individual histograms for the different horizons, for each of the horizons, I should say, we basically compute or we fit a distribution for each individual using standard methodology by Engelberg and others. So basically, this is assuming some beta distribution for the individuals who only use fewer than 3 bins. This is a triangular distribution. Anyway, standard methodology in this literature, you fit a distribution to the individual histogram for each individual at each horizon, and then basically compute the mean from this histogram, and then those mean expected inflation rates for each individual you then use in a regression. And specifically, what you do is you compare the post-treatment expected inflation with the control group, and so the particular way this is done is basically by regressing these expected inflation rates, mean inflation rates on a constant a dummy for the particular type of treatment that the individual received. So being randomly assigned to one of these treatment groups, and then a bunch of control variables that measure different sociodemographics, particularly. Okay, so what we're interested in now are these beta S coefficients, which basically measure the average treatment effect for each of these treatments S. Okay, so now we're looking at the individual treatments in addition to the pooled results. Okay, and we do this for 3 different horizons. For the 1 year ahead horizon, 2 to 3 years ahead, and 5 to 10 years ahead horizon. All right, and we use Huber weighting to deal with sort of outliers in these regressions. Okay, let's first look at the pooled regression results. So basically, again, combining all the treatments and comparing them to the control group. And we report this for the March wave in the top panel and the October 22 wave in the bottom panel. Again, for the 1 year ahead, 2 to 3 years ahead, and 5 to 10 years ahead horizon. The control groups had inflation expectations of 4.4, 4.3, and 3.8% at these various horizons in March, and then quite a bit higher, 6.15, 5.5, and 4.4% in October 22. Relative to the control groups, the treated groups basically had somewhat lower inflation expectations, so 20 basis points at the 1 year horizon in March and 30 basis points at the 2 to 3 year horizons in March, only an insignificant 7 basis points at the 5 to 10 year horizon in March. In October, these numbers were a bit higher, but also not dramatically higher, so 37 basis points in October at the 1 year horizon, 21 at the 2 to 3 and 5 to 10 year horizon. So as already suggested by the histograms that I showed you earlier, these treatments, pooled treatments, they work in the sense that they reduce the treated group's inflation expectations relative to the untreated control group by, let's say, moderate amounts. I mean, 37 basis points at the 1 year horizon is not nothing, but compared to the 6.15 of the control group at the time is also not a dramatic reduction towards the target. So I think this is one of the conclusions, that while these pieces of communication work, sort of they modestly, I think, shift inflation expectations towards the target, but significantly so. Okay, so these coefficients are mostly highly significant statistic. All right, now let's look at the individual treatments and to basically get a sense of which of these different types of communication, and again, they're all essentially taken one-to-one from ECB and National Central Bank communication. Let's see how much they have worked respectively in reducing inflation expectations, and we'll see some interesting differences there. So again, we have the control group here in the top, and then we have the 7 different treatments here summarized for the October 22 wave in the respective rows. And so we see that looking at the 1 year ahead horizon in the first column, the quantitative or numerical treatments, they both reduced inflation expectations to some degree with the revision. So the one where basically both the June and September staff projections were shown and suggesting basically a revision that this basically works a bit more strongly relative to the one that just gave the forecast. So I think this is one conclusion, is that when you show that things move in the right direction, that this works a bit more strongly than just giving sort of the path. In terms of the visuals, we find that the graph, so this chart I showed you, where inflation was first going up in 2022 and then projected to decline back towards the target over the next 2 years, this has quite a strong effect on inflation expectations at the 1 year horizon, and we'll see that this is actually also true at the 2 to 3 and 5 to 10 year horizon. So reducing inflation expectations much more strongly than some of these other treatments. The same information as in the revision numericals treatment presented in the table doesn't work as strongly at the 1 year horizon, but a little bit more strongly at the longer horizons. But these differences are probably not statistically significant. The one sort of treatment that sticks out a little bit that did not achieve a reduction in expected inflation is the high rates treatment. So the interview by President Joachim Nagel of the Bundesbank basically saying in this treatment that he projected inflation rates to remain high for some time. Now, when combining this sort of verbal statement about inflation rates remaining high for some time with a statement about the September 2022 75 basis point rate hike, we see that there's a bit of a reduction of inflation expectations, but not nearly as strong. So what we sort of conclude from this, these two treatments is that if you actually present households with a projection that inflation is going to remain high, well, you may be anchoring inflation expectations at these relatively higher levels to some degree. At least you're not achieving any reduction. And I should say that that probably wasn't also the intention of this particular interview to achieve a reduction in inflation expectations. But clearly, one thing that sticks out from this analysis is that when you just presenting this as a sort of projection that inflation may remain high for some time, you may actually sort of again steer inflation expectations in this particular way.
So Emmanuel, can I?
Yes.
So there's a question from the floor, but I'm also going to just throw another view on that that last point in. I mean, one thing that's really striking to me, at least, when you speak to non-economists about the effect of interest rates on inflation. So Oli Kobion and Yuri and others have these papers where they show the distinction, even for the recent, which you might think of as a kind of supply side inflation. Before that, there was this prevalence of households think high inflation goes with low growth, and high growth is associated with low inflation. Basically, good, bad.
Yeah.
Which is the opposite of professional forecasters. But if you speak to some of these people, particularly in the recent period, the cost channel of monetary policy is very prevalent in their head. So they think as businesses or cafes or whoever they are that, well, if my mortgage or my debt costs go up, I pass that on. Now, clearly, as economists, we think about that channel and our empirics, and I'm not talking about what you're doing here necessarily. I mean, like our macroeconometrics or whatever, they all suggest that that channel is weaker than the other channels. Other people don't think in general equilibrium. So it could be that what you're actually doing by saying rates will stay high is making people sort of activate that cost channel in their head. That's just a comment. Let me get Oleg Telegan has a comment. It's a clarification, I think. I may have missed in the presentation. Is it correct to say that the treatments differ in that only some of them provide information about inflation for the most recent periods and allow participants to calibrate their information about observed inflation? That is, only some participants have the opportunity to think, I thought it was 15% last year, but it turns out to be 8%. Is that true? And if so, does this explain the effectiveness of the graph, given it has if it has previous inflation? So how do you deal with the kind of priming part of it?
Yeah, I think I think that's right. I think this is sort of a slight inconsistency in that some of the treatments, particularly the graph, provide a bit more information on the current year or the past, the 2021 number. Now, the 2021 number was particularly low, and so 2.6%, if I remember correctly. And so there's a priming, maybe, was not particularly low, but it was lower than, of course, the numbers for the next 3 years. And so if that might be a concern, that's a number doesn't show up in some of the other treatments. That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we should probably acknowledge this. And maybe later some my co-authors can chime in on some of these details when we have the open sort of discussion at the end. Okay, then I just took note of this comment. All right, but let me just summarize this table and basically come or say that the one treatment that sort of achieved the strongest reduction in inflation expectations at the 1-year horizon is this GC action treatment. That's the excerpt from Isabel Schnabel's Jackson Hole speech. That was basically acknowledging that inflation is high and that this is a concern for many people, and that central banks are aware of this, but also suggesting that they're actually doing something to get things back in order, and specifically also referring to this rate hike. So this is something that we see works particularly well in the short, at least in the shortest horizon, but also has fairly strong effects at these medium to longer term horizons. All right. And again, the graph we saw, I already mentioned this earlier, has basically across horizons, the 1 year, 2 to 3, and 5 to 10 year has the strongest overall effects. Okay. Now, it's difficult to really interpret these sort of these findings, and especially the one that basically this Isabel Schnabel comment or excerpt of a speech has apparently been so powerful in our survey. We sort of loosely try to interpret things by basically looking at the language that she chose specifically, and so we basically see that she's using words such as the inflation has been a dominant concern of citizens in many countries, and she basically said that central banks would have to act forcefully in times of high inflation so that the public would not lose confidence in the central bank bringing inflation back to the 2% target. That's actually also sort of a difference with respect to some of these other treatments, that she reiterated the 2% target. As I mentioned earlier, everybody has had at the beginning, before the treatments, received information on the 2% target, but this is sort of the treatment that also sort of repeated this essentially. And so this also might have contributed to this particular treatment's effectiveness. So the soothing, reassuring tone, the overall sort of the signaling overall confidence about achieving the target over the policy horizon, omitting numbers about current inflation figures, but focusing on the 2% target instead, which is of course lower than the currently high rates, or at the time high rates. We interpret as being as contributing to this particular treatment's effectiveness. Okay. In terms of the chart, which also we found contributed, had a strong effect. We see also the information about the 2% target shown in this chart, so that probably helps to some degree in anchoring or steering participants' inflation expectations back towards this 2% target that the ECB pursues. The trajectory, basically inflation rates coming down over the projection horizon, is also something that probably helps. And of course, the 21 figure, the 2.6%, which also shows up in this chart, basically relates to the not so distant positive past that maybe individuals sort of associate with and have recall of. And then also there's psychological literature that finds that the blue color is usually found pleasant and trustworthy in sort of visual communication, and the ECB probably purposefully so chose a blue color for this as background for this chart, and that's also the color that often the Bundesbank uses in their communication. So probably purposefully so. All right.
So Emmanuel,
yes.
I said about 45 minutes, but we've interrupted enough that we'll just keep going at a steady, happy pace. There's a question from the floor from Vasilios. I find the outcomes extremely interesting, especially with the GC action. However, during Schnabel's speech in Jackson Hole, Lane offered another speech with the famous terminal rate providing contradictory outcomes. in an environment in which we cannot actually control the information given to people, how can we actually reach the right balance, and whose words would actually matter in the end? And I'm gonna add in another one. So I guess that's a comment for the real world, not about your experiment where you do control the information. Because I know she's busy today, but my student Lavisa, who has studied a lot the issue of gender. I wonder if you looked at, I know the next slide teased me because it had heterogeneity on it. So I just looked at the effects by gender, because I wonder, did Schnabel have a particularly resonant effect with the females in your sample?
We looked at that also in light of some of the recent work by Andreas Fuster and Michael Weber and others who argued that the sender of the message makes a difference. We didn't find anything there. To my surprise, or to me being East German, we actually found the strongest effect of that particular soothing Schnabel statement on East Germans, so quite a bit stronger than for West Germans, and it's actually the only treatment that worked significantly so for East Germans. Now we only have about 800 East Germans in the panel, so it's a relatively small set, and so maybe sort of the power of this result is not super strong. But again, among those 800, the only one that worked is the significantly so is the Isabel Schnabel's statement, which again reinforced that the central bank is in charge and really caring about the concerns of the citizens, sort of roughly speaking. So coming back to controlling who to actually to sort of transmit the message to, I think is a different context that we can't really study in this particular setup. But I think this is clearly something that the central banks are thinking about and worrying about, and giving their communication efforts in all kinds of different channels and types of media. We know that they're sort of working on this in the background, but it's something that our study cannot really speak to. Yeah.
Okay.
So let me just quickly move on and try to finish on time. So we have a couple of further aspects that we study: uncertainty, heterogeneity, persistence, and learning. And let me talk about each of these quickly in turn. So from the individual distributions that we fit to the bins, we can also back out a measure of uncertainty, essentially the standard deviation of this fitted histogram, and then study to what extent the different treatments reduce uncertainty at the individual level. And we find that most of these treatments actually do reduce uncertainty at the various horizons and in meaningful ways. So the information doesn't only help to lower inflation expectations, but it also helps to basically reduce the uncertainty about inflation. The differences aren't very sort of large. Most of these treatments work in similar ways, reducing uncertainty. In terms of the heterogeneity, I already mentioned what's written here in this first bullet points. Overall, the effects that we find are driven by the West German population. The East Germans don't really respond. But again, they do respond strongly to Isabel's Jackson Hole speech. In terms of other sort of sociodemographics, we find that less educated populations seem particularly responsive to the verbal soothing communications, whereas the visuals, the graph in particular, achieves the largest decrease in expected inflation for people, especially without a college degree. And then women have higher inflation expectations in the particularly long term in our sample, and that's true. I think that's consistent with many other studies. We find that numerical information, so these forecasts and forecast revision treatments, they seem to affect more the male population, whereas the visual representations such as the graph seem to be equally potent across both male and female, especially in the short. How persistent are these effects? There's a question that often comes up. So do people sort of remember these types of information? We can't really study this for the entire sample, but we do have individuals in our survey basically rotating in and out of the survey. And so after 6 months particularly, there's a relatively large number that rotate back in. So For those, we can basically see if, without treating them again, if sort of their inflation expectations are lower than a control group after 6 months. And we do see that to be the case, but not statistically significant for most of the treatments. So the coefficients are all negative, essentially, but not statistically significantly so, with one exception. But again, this might be a bit by luck. So again, we think that these effects can be somewhat persistent, but the sample size is fairly small, and so there's maybe quite a bit of noise, and more would have to be done to study the actual persistence of these types of communication. Finally, let me so quickly summarize that basically quantitatively, we can think of these information provisions as shifting the posterior beliefs of the individuals relative to their priors. And so to the extent that posterior beliefs are different from prior beliefs, then central bank information or communication has actually meaningfully sort of affected these beliefs. And so one can basically frame this in a context of Bayesian learning, following Ollie's and Yuri's work. And if you do so, then basically this coefficient G would be sort of the gain that people put on the signal from the central bank, so the weight that they put on the signal. And so if this is sort of statistically significantly different from zero, then central bank information is basically credible and perceived as informative, okay? When in turn this is not statistically significantly different from zero, then you would sort of conclude that the central bank information is not informative, and so prior and posterior would then coincide. So we can essentially summarize our results in sort of this Bayesian learning type of framework and assess to what extent these coefficients G or 1 minus G are different from 0 or 1 respectively. And we see sort of in line with the coefficients found in the literature that basically the signals provided by the different treatments, they seem to be perceived as informative. They do significantly shift individuals' beliefs in sort of quantitatively in line with what other people in this literature have found. When we look at basically sample splits where we distinguish between people who have said that they focus a lot on inflation and with people that have said that they don't focus as much on inflation, we do see some smaller differences, but not as large as I would have personally expected. Although for some of the treatments, these differences are larger than for others, and also statistically significantly so. Okay, especially those with paying a lot of attention to inflation. Some of these treatments work much more strongly than those who say they don't really focus so much on inflation developments. All right, and this is basically true for some of these other treatments as well, as we see in some of these coefficients. All right, let me now wrap up to leave enough time for questions. We conclude from our study that central banks should KISS. They should keep it super simple when communicating with the broader public, and that's specifically or especially true in times when inflation rates are elevated. We think that our results suggest that simple and concise verbal explanations can effectively reduce inflation expectations in the short run, but also in the medium and longer run, as we've seen. And graphical representations, in particular, of the inflation projections, seem to have a quite strong and most consistent effect across all horizons. Okay. So with that, let me end here, and hopefully we have some time for questions. Thank you.
It's only been 3-4 years and I was still on mute. Don't worry, I will eventually catch on. That was excellent, Emmanuel. Thank you very much for that. I know Laura is here, so I will give her a chance if she wants to add anything in. But one of the great things about this group is we have the sort of nerdy people like you and me who spend their days doing experiments or analyzing the data, And then we have the people whose job it is to actually sometimes craft statements or craft the speeches. And we get many of those joining the call, and including our very own Gabrielle. So I'm going to let him go first to give a reaction from. Yeah, I don't want to portray these as completely separate, because he also spends his day analyzing the data. It's just yeah, he has a different set of paymasters to answer to when he's doing this. So Gabriel, why don't you give some reaction and comment?
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for the insights, which was a pleasure to hear, because they speak from my heart. And you might know that conversations inside a central bank on this particular topic are not always easy when you speak to lots of economists who would like to be precise, who insists on nuance, and then to come with a message, keep it super simple, is let's just say it requires discussion. It's in fact the job that I'm doing when we're trying to make the monetary policy statement itself more attractive and more readable. And actually, it's me and a team here. We work on this visual, the kind of the visual monetary policy statement, as we call it, the monetary policy statement at a glance. And it's great to hear that exactly that has the biggest impact, and we shall certainly use the findings in internal discussions here. I had one point, and that is on the soothingness. I can tell you from the inside, we had long discussions to what extent the governing council should even say inflation is too high for too long, which has an element of empathy. Inflation is not just a number, it is too high, and it's too high for too long. And there's a different points of views. Some people say, no, the central bank should just say the facts as they are. We are not the mother of the Eurozone citizens who have the soothing job. We have a job. We have to ascertain the fact and do something about it. And I personally, I've always thought a bit of empathy would help. And we were looking at Jay Powell when he says in his opening statement, I know what this means for American families and businesses, and rest assured, we will do what is necessary. And that is something that Jay Powell can say. That's not something that's basically finds consensus on this side of the Atlantic. And we also spoke to colleagues at the Bank of England who basically came to the opposite conclusion, and they said, we don't want to hear from the central bank that it's bad. We want to hear from the central bank they're going to work on it and they're going to get it right. So it's very interesting to see that in terms of what it does for inflation expectation, that soothing element is very important. But just to say, there's different perspectives that might be worth looking into also on that front. And that was just the main point. Apart from what Michael said already, it's great to always combine the practitioners and the people who analyzed us. So these were my initial comments. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Let me just add one thing. So I've been very surprised. I did that original work with Andy looking at some of these public communication. I've always been slightly surprised how angry some economists get with me, and now anybody else who does this, partly because we get obsessed with this idea of precision. And I do think precision's important. I mean, I started my career in the Bank of England, and I learned how to write in a way that was so turgid but so precise that it was really majestic in a way. But one thing that occurred to me in the last year or two, I have this paper with Matthew Naylor where we try to explore what types of complexity matter, and a lot of it is conceptual, and I think economists get even more upset at simplifying conceptually. Like, I'm going to use the word jobs when really what I mean is economic activity. They're not the same thing, right? We know this as sort of wonkish technocratic type of people. But to me, what's weird is, like, most of us who have, certainly those of us who are academics, when we teach, we do exactly this. We trade off precision and accessibility and clarity. Like, I don't stand in front of my first year Oxford students and teach them Clary de Galli Gertler's model in all of its detail and make precisely what each parameter is. No, we talk a bit loosely about things. We have simplified models. Everything's linear. So it's sort of a weird thing, because we do this sort of accessibility, and generating interest, and we trade that off against precision when we teach. But as soon as we think about doing it in a kind of central bank environment, people seem to get very angry, and I don't fully understand it. Anyway, so that's my little philosophical rant. I'll stop now. Laura, did you have anything that you wanted to add in? I mean, Emmanuel did a fantastic job presenting it, but I've also seen you present it, and you did a fantastic job when you presented it. So if you had anything you wanted to add.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I can only agree with you that Emmanuel did a fantastic job. Maybe just a touch up on Oleg's question before that came up in the chat regarding priming our respondents or not. So thank you, Oleg, once again for making this very important point. Indeed, the graphical treatment is the only treatment that contains this historic inflation figure of 2021. I would personally not view this as priming, because in this case, it's kind of part of the information provision. I think, as Emmanuel already mentioned a couple of times during the presentation, is that in this paper, obviously, we're not able to tease out each and every element of the treatments and why exactly, like which element exactly leads to the success in stabilizing inflation expectations, but maybe we'll just leave this for future work and hopefully be able to tease out exactly this. For example, whether providing additional historic inflation figures will be more effective additionally to informational forecasts and forecast revisions. Yeah.
Great. Okay. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to add one extra point, and then we will wrap up. And that's something which you didn't do, and I'm going to suggest it as something that you can do in the future, because I think it's sort of interesting and important, and it builds off my slightly philosophical rant. And I'll tell you my little attempt to do it in the past, but I wouldn't say I've got anywhere close to closing the door on it. And that's the extent to which different mediums of messaging, like you had in your paper, the extent to which they generate differences in understanding about the uncertainty. So this is something which I've always called, in my head at least, and a couple of times publicly, the uncertainty critique of KISS or engaging with the broader public. And that's this idea that as soon as we make the trade-off that I was alluding to, and we start making things clear and accessible, but we also make them little bit less imprecise, and we've had to accept that somehow we don't communicate uncertainty. And actually, one of my papers has a model of this, the one with Alistair Macaulay and Andy Haldane, where we almost bake it in. Like, it's not a very deep model, but we do bake it in. But essentially, it's one where if you communicate simply, the market, you communicate in your usual way at the markets, and they understand fan charts and whatever else you do. But when you communicate with the public simply, they take it as like a promise. And one thing we know about, forecasts is they're going to be wrong. Sometimes they'll be a little bit wrong. Sometimes they're going to be stupendously wrong. And when you get them really wrong, the people who trusted your simple message will be like, wait a second. Emmanuel told me inflation would be down to 2% by 2015, but there's been another oil shock or another something else, and he's obviously a liar. And so dynamically, is it costly? And I'll tell you, I presented something at the AA in 2020, which was a pilot where I tried to see whether some of these different things, including graphical, using Bank of England data, communicated uncertainty. And I'm going to tell you a really depressing result. I've said it a few times on this webinar. The really depressing result was that simplified communication did not convey less uncertainty, but not because it was as accurate, but because even the complicated stuff doesn't convey uncertainty very well. And this is a sort of well-known thing. Most normal people do not understand uncertainty very well. There's a professor in Cambridge whose job is about, risk and, communication of uncertainty and risk. And he has books written on this fact that the general public do not understand probability distributions in a sensible way. So that's my challenge to you, to try to see whether we can. Yeah, and sorry, I don't mean to just be picking on you and your co-authors here. I mean the community. I think that's a question that we still need to answer. How does a central bank accurately convey uncertainty? And Gabriel's going to tell us the answer with a two-hander.
No, I don't want to tell you the answer. I just want to two-hander. We have exactly the same conversation when we have a topic, how much should we, as a central bank, communicate about climate? Because climate allows us to connect with people who have no interest in the central bank, but they're very interested in climate. And exactly when we go, in a sense, too simple, people start to think the central bank can do something about the climate. We can make our contribution, but they shouldn't think that it's within our power to turn this around. And so it's exactly that's the point that Michael was making. How can you say something by at the same time saying this is the limits of our power? There's only so much we can do, and there's so much uncertainty. That was a two-hander. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
so,
so Emmanuel, do you have any
yeah.
last words?
No last words. I think these are all great suggestions for sort of follow-up work. I also think we only sort of are still scratching on the surface of all this. Again, this was really a very sort of simple, practically minded exercise, taking actual pieces of communication and trying to see if, how they work and if they work in the intended way. But then you have to sort of do more work to really tease out which of these different dimensions are especially sort of useful. And then on the uncertainty, I agree that even these histograms that these bins that we provide households with might be too complicated for some of them, but it's an interesting sort of agenda to measure individual uncertainty in a meaningful way and to check if communication can lower it and also in a meaningful way. Anyway, thanks a lot for the feedback and questions. That was very useful, and I hope to see you all soon.
Yeah. Okay. Great. That is our last one for the summer break. So everybody, maybe those in other parts of the world don't realize our European culture of July and August being very much summer months to spend enjoying hopefully better weather than we've had in Europe for the last few weeks. So yeah, everybody, keep it simple super simple over the summer too, and enjoy yourselves, and hopefully we'll see you again in September.